warm welcome to everyone. Thanks for joining this session today for another Open Dev Talk. I'm Kevin, I'm the host for this session, and we'll focus on the new Sandbox environment that we released on the High Mobility platform. It's quite a big change. We've had a lot of updates. We've had a Sandbox since many years, but this is a completely new environment, which also makes testing a lot more realistic before switching to working with live cars on the platform. So it will be quite a technical deep dive. We'll start with a bit of an overview, what has changed and what you can expect. But then also I'll go into specifics in how to use the API, the Sandbox API to add, for instance, activating vehicles, receiving data from the vehicles, and also showcasing the new simulator that we have. So we'll start with a pretty generic overview, and then we go quite a lot deeper. So it might take some time this session today. At any point of time, feel free to post a question in the chat. We'll pick it up in the middle of the talk for sure, but also in the end, we'll go through any questions that might have popped up or that have been left unanswered. Without much further introduction, let's get into a bit of a technical details, and I'll share my screen to begin with. Okay, here we go. So the platform is such, if you're logged into High Mobility to our console, it looks at first the same. So we have our kind of build section, that's our Sandbox, and live data section. But both the kind of develop mode, the app or data containers as such, and the simulation studio, where we have the car simulator, have changed. And there are also some new features when it comes to testing different activation scenarios. If I go into the simulation studio, I have one created already. So let's have a look at that, and I can show you a bit of the kind of visual parts to begin with as a soft start. So as soon as I get into the simulator, I can see currently the neutral car. The neutral car is basically non-branded. It means that this car supports or showcases all the different data points that we support in our live environment across all different brands. So up in the right corner, we have like currently it's showing like 7 different data points out of 203 data points in total. And those 203 data points also match what we support in the live environment from across all different brands. So it's a visual representation. So a bit of a nice overview. We also have the console down here where we can see all types of events. And as soon as I'll start to show different kind of data retrieval requests, they will pop up here. You can name your simulator to anything if you like to. It's also possible to download the console, and that's the kind of main part of the first view. Then we have the capabilities. So the capabilities, this is the list of all the different attributes and data points that this specific simulator supports. It's a pretty big list in this case because it's over 200 data points. You can also filter it. For instance, I'm only interested in diagnostics data, and as soon as it's selected, it just shows me diagnostics data, so it's a bit more easier to navigate. It's also have a search function that can be used as well. You can also choose a few different capabilities, so a mix of charging and diagnostics, for instance. So as soon as I have this set up, I can always change attributes. This is very similar to how the old simulator was working because I can still set different state of the vehicles, bring up the console. You can also always see that I updated the state of the car now to estimated range 504 kilometers. Can also change it to miles, for instance, and it continuously updates the state. You see there is a push here, and I'll come back to that because that's one of the major new features of the simulator. It supports push data. So if you're using MQTT or also other streaming capabilities that's coming up on the platform, the simulator is fully supporting it. We got the events. So the events, that's the webhooks, and it's possible to trigger them from here. We'll not go into too deep into webhooks today, but it's supported just as for the old simulator that you can trigger webhooks like an accident from here and receive those events. And then the scene. So this is one major update that we have on the simulator, that you can configure your own scenes or choose a scene. So a scene is basically a data set that matches what a manufacturer supports from real cars. So with the neutral car, as I mentioned, it's across all the scenes. So if I have the neutral car, it basically has a combined data set from all these different brands that are listed here. But if I want to work with something specific like BMW Mini data, I choose that scene. And if I go back to capabilities, you can see here we have 70 different data points. We also have here a BMW that is shown here, and a bit of a different overview. Currently, it's showing 3 different data points. You can kind of change the state directly from here as a convenience feature. But the most important part is that really this data set is filtered down to exactly that data set from BMW and Mini. So whatever kind of permissions you have in your data container when you're retrieving data, if BMW doesn't support that data attribute, you wouldn't receive it back, just as it would be the case for a live case. Just to kind of show around a few different examples, so I choose the Porsche scene. I go back. You can also see now I have again a different data set. I have a Porsche here now that is displayed as well, the Cross Turismo, and just a convenient way of working with different data sets. And importantly, you don't need to create like a new simulator for each one of these brands and then switch between them, have different access tokens to all of those. You can really dynamically change the scene completely from here. And if you have activated this vehicle, the VIN remains the same, just the kind of data set, the virtual data set changes. You might see also that we have combined some brands here. We have Alfa Romeo, Fiat, Jeep, and BMW Mini, of course, that's 2 brands, and then Peugeot, Citroën, DS, Opel, Vauxhall as one bundle. That's basically because coming from the same OEM groups or manufacturer groups, these models basically support the same data set. So it doesn't make sense to create a different scene for each brand if several brands provide exactly the same data set. So even if you select this and we show you a Peugeot, it's basically you get the same data set for all those brands that are listed. So for instance, a Citroën. So this is one of the kind of key updates, because as soon as we add more data to our live environment, this will always be reflected in the simulator. It will instantly, as we launch a new brand for live data in our platform, that will always be matching here, that you can always choose it in the simulator. And there's a kind of nice kind of bonus, of course, dark mode. So if you're working in the night, it can be a nice feature to work in the dark mode instead of having all this contrast that's otherwise can be a bit busy for the eyes. So that's how the simulator kind of looks like, and on top of it, it's more or less the same functionality as we had in the old one, but there's a lot of different things going on in the hood, which makes this much more powerful. The only feature that didn't make it into the first release is the simulation feature. That's more or less the way that we had, that you could actually simulate a journey from point A to point B, and during that drive, all different data updates are being done. We will have a similar feature coming up. The old one was pretty advanced, but also a bit difficult to use, I would say. It took some time to learn it. So we are coming up with a new way of kind of creating these journeys that is a bit more straightforward and useful for everyone. Now I have my simulator here, and the other change is the Sandbox application. So let's go ahead and create one. And the first thing you'll notice in this new Sandbox environment, that we have a prompt as you create a new application, if it's for a single driver or a fleet. And the reason for that is that in today's market, there's quite a difference how consent is done, how vehicle activation is done, and even what type of data is available if you're building a service for individual owners of vehicles or for commercial cases, so for fleets. So we have distinguished it here already, because as soon as we know what type of service you're building, we can provide you a more realistic environment and also more realistic data sets in the end. So I'll choose here a fleet. So I'll start with a fleet use case, because this is one of the most exciting things with this new Sandbox, because we didn't have a Sandbox APIs for Fleet before, but we do now. As soon as I create the Sandbox container, we will have an app ID, and we will have a list of attributes that are selected. Currently by default, we just select like the odometer. So as usual, you go in and change the individual data points you're interested in. And for this purpose of this demo, I'm not really interested in any specific data points, so I'll just select one of these preset that has a bunch of different data, and that's good enough for me. Then we have linked simulators. So this is whenever we start work with simulators, they will show up here. Then we have service account API keys. So the service account API keys, these are the APIs that are used, or the credentials that are used for our fleet clearance API, and also for some other APIs, but importantly, the fleet clearance API, so I'll be using this today. We got the OAuth client, so it's possible to kind of renew access tokens if you're using a REST API, for instance. We have the client certificates for using the REST API, GraphQL API, or Node.js SDK. And this is the new feature. You can also generate MQTT certificates right from here. So this was previously only possible for live data containers. When you consume data from live vehicles, you can now also generate these credentials and use MQTT for the simulator. And lastly, we've got webhooks. This is the same functionality as we've had on the platform before. So to use this, I've now configured the data set. So the next thing, what I really want to do is I want to get some simulators linked so that I can start retrieving data for these vehicles. And in general, the workflow is just as for the live environment. So there's no differences really, just some different URLs, which I will show. So I'll go to the fleet clearance tutorial, because more or less I will be following this tutorial, but obviously in a bit more fast forward approach. Otherwise, this would take our whole day or evening. But basically, it's possible to follow along using these steps all the way. So first thing, what I want to really do is I want to create a clearance. So creating a clearance. So even if I created a simulator, I have the simulator. The simulator has a VIN. And I created a data container, but there's no link between them. Just as in the real life, if you create a data container in a platform, there's no link, there's no clearance for a specific vehicle on the roads, and there are millions of vehicles. So it's possible, you need to do for a fleet case, you have to go ahead and create this type of clearance. We do have Postman files, but to really show exactly what's going on with less magic, I will try to do it more or less manually. So following this, what I need to do is I need to create just use this snippet to create a clearance for the vehicle that I created. Let me go ahead and open up a new window, and we can work with this. I'll zoom in so we can see what's going on. So I'm using the snippets from the platform, so that's pretty more or less one of the more convenient way of doing it. And here in the example snippets, we do have like api.highmobility.com. Of course, that's our live API. So in all cases where we work with Sandbox, if it's for MQTT or anything else, it's a simple rule, and it's just to prepend a Sandbox in the beginning of the URL, and we always kind of go to the Sandbox environment, and that's nothing else is different than that. Second, we have here, we create a clearance, we pass in the VINs, so you could actually create the clearances for several simulators at the same time. For our purpose, we just start with our simulator. So let me go back. I'll open that in a new window, but I'll go back to my simulation studio and go ahead and launch the simulator once again. Here we go. We can see that as soon as it initializes, you can also see it in the URL, but as soon as the vehicle initializes, we got a VIN. Because always when you work in live environment, you work with the vehicle identification number. Every car has one. The same thing here, that every simulator has a VIN. So that's the first thing I need to enter here, because I need to kind of pass in what VIN I will be using, and then the brand. So working in the Sandbox, it's always Sandbox. So even if you're working with a scene, if it's BMW or so on, you will always work with Sandbox, because in the end you can change the brand or the scene in the simulator at any point of time. So when you create a clearance, you always have to use Sandbox. And this last thing, of course, off token. So I need to authenticate that this is my data container. So I'll go back here to my service account keys. I will create a new key. Open it up. So it generates a key that I can use. And of course, we do have here a tutorial for how to create this authentication key. And we also have some samples for that. So for simplicity, I've already downloaded one of our samples. It's using JavaScript. We can see it uses Sandbox API. And then I have to pass in an API key and private key. And these are exactly the two things that I just created. So I can go ahead and copy paste it. I got the ID. Put that in. And then I got my private key. Make sure I get everything. I copy that and I put it in here. Okay, so now the API key and private key, and these are basically what identifies to our servers that this is your data container that want to create an auth key, and that auth key is then used for further authentication for all the endpoints for the fleet clearance API. I'll execute this in my terminal. So create auth token. Here we go. So now I have an auth token, so I can start using this. This one is valid for about approximately 1 hour. And so I can hide this, won't need this more for now. I shouldn't need this as well. And instead I'll just go in and enter the authorization here. And now I should be able to just go ahead and execute this in the terminal, and that would create a clearance for this specific vehicle. So let me go ahead and try that. Also try to output that to get some better, nice looking JSON. So it worked because I got back a response. It says that for this VIN, the clearance request is pending. It's always pending. So this is the same in live environment. This activation process is always an asynchronous process. So we always return a pending status for a vehicle. And then it's possible to subscribe to webhooks to see when a vehicle state is changing. But you can also check the status manually as well. So I can do the second step. I can actually have a look like manually how this is, if it gets approved. And I'm using a different endpoint for that. So if I go into the docs, we have the fleet clearance endpoints. So right now I was using the post request where I basically passed in the vehicle to be cleared. And here I have the get request, for instance, to get all the statuses of all the different vehicles. And you can see here also the kind of summary that we have a Sandbox server and a production server. Let's construct that manually. So we, instead of a post request, we do a get. It's pretty simple in the, as it's a RESTful API, I don't need any type of parameters. So this should be enough actually to get the status. And we can now see that the status is approved. So we always pass along a change log. So we can see here that we added the vehicle at approximately 2042 and then 45, so 3 seconds later it got approved. That means that I can also now see in my linked simulators, I can see that this has been linked. There is an active connection to that, so I can start receiving data from that vehicle. And there's two ways of doing it, more or less. There's a push API, MQTT, or you can use the REST API. I'll show the REST API a bit later, but I think the more interesting part for us is to dive directly into MQTT, because that's the new part. And also for fleet use cases, what we see our customers always preferring the integration of a push API. So to get that, so I need to go into and create an MQTT certificate. I will generate one here. As soon as I generate the certificates, you can see I got 3 files. I got the root certificate or the server certificate authority certificates. I got the my client certificate, and I also got a private key for my client. More or less, to kind of use this, you can also just use the MQTT tutorial. So going through this step by step, We also have some comments here, what's different from Sandbox, for instance, and I will show you that. In the end, I can just go and use one of the snippets again. So I'll use this snippet for how to connecting to our MQTT broker. Let's go back and use the terminal for this. So we got 3 files. These are it wants to get the certificate authority file, client certificate, and private key. So all these things I now have. I can also open it up in a new window here. Downloads. Yeah, I can just go into, yeah. So I got the 3 files here. So I'll just use this first identifier, or I can take the whole name to be sure. So this UUID that you see in the beginning, that's it's a unique client ID for that specific MQTT certificate. So here we have CA certificates. I'll get the next one, the client certificate, and then the private key as well. Next one is the kind of URL. So this is by default, this snippet is again showing the production environment. So if I work with Sandbox, I would just type in Sandbox in the beginning. That's it. Port remains the same. And here on the path side, so the first thing, we always have a distinction between live data and Sandbox data. So I will use Sandbox here. So same thing here, just changing live to Sandbox, level 13, and then I need to enter my specific app ID because all the data from my linked vehicles is posted on the topic of this app ID. And then lastly, it also wants the kind of identifier for the MQTT certificate, which is the unique ID that we are using. Oh, I don't need to save that, sorry. Okay, so now I got my snippet set up. Let's go ahead and run it in the terminal. Here we go. Also, the JQ is just a JSON prettifier, so we get some nicer output to the terminal. Connection seems to work. As soon as I connect, now it starts to listen to any updates from the vehicle. So we can now go back to our car. Let me choose, it doesn't matter. We can work with, why not work with that scene. Now we go in different attributes, and we should choose something that this vehicle has access to. So as soon as you create a link to a vehicle, you can filter the data set based on an application. It's also a neat feature because you get much more better use of the real estate of the screen. So now that I have created the link to this My Fleet app, my data container, I can just choose that, and all the data points are filtered already to exactly that data set that's available for my data container. Otherwise, if I would change any attributes here, then and I don't have access to it, of course it's not pushed onto my MQTT feed. Let's make the screen a bit more smaller. Let's go back here. Let's see, we have some interesting things like the odometer. Get the terminal lined up right next to it. And let's change something. So we also can bring up the console here a bit. We got the odometer. Now let's change it to 3,050 kilometers. You can see it pushes that data onto here in the console that it pushes. Then it takes some seconds for this to kind of trickle down all the system, but in the end you see it ends up here in my terminal where I'm subscribed to all updates. You can see diagnostics odometer, the new value is 3,050. So as soon as I change it again, same thing will happen. It will be pushed and then delivered to my MQTT client. Works with the same with all different attributes. I changed the fuel level. You can see here now we get 22.5. Next inspection date. I can also change the location. Let's say I'm currently somewhere else. Let's say I'm in London with my vehicle. And as soon as I update that, it's also pushed onto the feed. And we get the new latitude, longitude here as well. So a pretty straightforward approach in kind of testing different attributes with the pushed API. in the end exactly like it does in the real life. And of course, as soon as we introduce the simulation feature, like the journey simulation feature, I think will add a lot of value as well, because you can really then create a journey and just listen for new data to trickle down to your MQTT client. That's one key thing about the new simulator. And what I also wanted to show about the clearance flow is that, of course, and now when I was creating a clearance, I was using the VIN of my simulator. So if I would try something else, let's get back this into a bit more highlighted scene. So now I have, if I would try to kind of create a clearance for a vehicle that doesn't exist at all, so I can just make up that I want to create it for like this type of VIN, which doesn't exist. So I can still try to execute it. And you can see that it still kind of is pending, because we, at this point, we don't know if this vehicle actually exists or not in your case. But if you get the status, status is rejected. So that vehicle simulator doesn't exist. So the vehicle is automatically rejected. So you can also basically try those type of scenarios easily as well. Now, one other thing about the Sandbox API for fleet clearance is that we have a completely new feature called virtual VINs. So virtual VINs is for testing certain scenarios, but also sometimes to really have a very simple workflow to get data without having to set up all or work with the simulator at the same point of time. Let me show you how that works. So we have this documented in our guide for fleet clearance. We have a new section called Sandbox Virtual VINs. And these virtual VINs, they are basically like reserved VINs. So you can be sure that no simulator that you generate will ever have this VIN. And they have different defined behaviors. Because one of the things we have in the live environment, for instance, is that if you want to activate vehicles of a certain brand, it might require you to provide a control measure. This is like a sanity check if you're in possession of the car. So it asks you to provide in the odometer value, for instance. And of course, simulator, we don't have that. But if you want to try simulate that feature, you can do it with this virtual VIN, because as soon as you kind of add that and the VIN is incorrect, it would fail, it would get rejected. We also have a VIN that always stays in the pending state. So if you try to add it, it doesn't get approved after 3 seconds. It just stays in the pending state. And we have one other reserved VIN that gets rejected after 3 hours. So these are just like the first data set we start with for most use cases. But if you have any request of other type of behaviors, we're happy to expand this list, which can be done pretty easily. Let's try one of those though. Let's try to use this reserved VIN for where a control measure is required. Let me go back here and create. So I will create a new vehicle. I will use this reserved VIN. Brand is Sandbox, but now I need to provide some additional things. So I'm just following the API reference where we have the fleet clearance described. So we have even an example here for control measure for Mercedes-Benz. So we need to pass in a control measures object, odometer, and value in unit. Hopefully it doesn't take me too much time to kind of type this out manually. Let me put this in, control and measures. So we have an object, and then we got the odometer, because the control measures might be different than odometer in the future, but right now we just have the odometer. And then we have value, that should be 2050 in the case for this vehicle. And then we got the unit that is in kilometers. But maybe for the fun of it, we can just try something else. So let's pass in like 1, that the mileage, and let's see if it works. So basically this vehicle should get rejected because the control measure check fails. As usual, we get the pending state first because it tries to activate it. We can also get the status of a specific vehicle. So I can follow along here and just pass in the VIN and just get the status for that car. Yeah, it got rejected. So after 5 seconds, it got rejected, so it didn't work out. So let's try again. And this time we actually pass in the correct mileage, which is 2015. And try it again. So it's in pending state. We go back and try to get the status of this car. Let's see if it succeeds. It's approved. So after approximately 5 seconds, it went to approved. So the mileage check worked out, and it's now possible to use this data. So the interesting part about this is that with these virtual VINs, we can also have some kind of predefined behaviors. So it's possible to pull data for this vehicle, but it also pushes data every 1 minute or even more often, actually. So I can actually now see in our MQTT feed if we have any data that's coming in for this virtual vehicle. Let me have a quick look if I'm still connected. I'm not sure. Let's reconnect just to be safe. And we got this approved. So we should be seeing some data coming in every minute. Maybe we need to give it some time and come back to it. But as soon as in a periodical method, it basically generates new data, and it pushes it to the MQTT feed. So let's leave this open for now, I think, and let's see if we come back a bit later and see if we got some data coming in from that vehicle. So that's already quite a handful. This is how the Sandbox works, and the virtual VINs as well. We have also looked at the kind of functionality of the simulator itself. And the last thing, perhaps, we can also look at the kind of individual driver consent, because that's also, we have some changes for that. So to try it out, we go back and also first create a new simulator. So the same thing as when we create a new simulator, we choose if it's for a single driver, if it's for a consumer use case or for a fleet use case. You can choose it here. When that's done, and I'll go into scenes, you can see we have a bit of a different setup here. We have fewer brands than for the fleet case, because generally for fleet data, there's more data available. But nevertheless, I can choose these different scenes. For instance, now I could work with Ford. I can see Ford data here. And now that I have this simulator created, I can also go ahead and create a data container for the individual driver case. It's possible to choose here if you're working with like a cloud integration or a device app. So if it's really super consumer focused, you would choose, and you build with our iOS and Android SDKs, you would choose it here. But for this demo, I will use a cloud app again, choose a bunch of permissions. And the same thing applies here. The difference with the driver is that instead of using the fleet clearance API as we have been doing right now, we're using our OAuth2 API to generate consent. And so our OAuth2 API is using our OAuth2 credentials. And so there is like a consent flow. And now before we did have a simple consent flow also for the old Sandbox, but now we also have it a bit more refreshed, so a bit more realistic in how that works. Let's go through the steps, and we do that by starting from here. We have a Postman config, really the easiest way to work with it, because here we have already a pre-built auth URI that has the client ID, OAuth2 client ID already set, and I can open up and create it. I also need to first kind of configure the redirect URI, because we have an allow list for that. In an update, we will add the Postman redirect URI automatically, but for now I need to add it. And then I could just open up this and go into the consent flow. So as soon as I go into the consent screen, you can see this is more or less what the vehicle owner would see in the end when granting access to your application. It shows all the different data points that this data container has been configured with, and it's possible to authorize it. And then selecting one of the simulator that have been created. So we do list here currently both fleet and the driver simulators, because we can allow you to kind of have some flexibility here. If you really want to try for some reason the fleet data sets for your individual driver apps, but for best clarity, I will use this Ford simulator that I just created. And once I grant that consent, it redirects back to the redirect URI, which is for me is Postman. And here now I got the auth code. So I got the OAuth code, and in the OAuth 2 procedure, this is always then used for exchanging for an access token that is then used to access data. So I will have to work a bit quick here before my code expires, but I open up Postman. I got here the high mobility Postman collection already imported. It's linked from many places. We have it on GitHub, and I need to get an environment. The Postman environment I can download from here, and this environment is already then configured with exactly the OAuth credentials and app ID of the specific data container, which makes it so much easier to work with. I'll go ahead and import that file. Let me go here. We have the downloads, Postman environment. Here we go. And you can see here the app ID, for instance, ends with 202. So same as here. So it's all kind of dynamically set. I would choose to work with this environment. And as soon as I've done the OAuth code, we have in the Postman collection, we have the endpoint configured for exchanging a code to an access token. So now I have to go back to this code that I got and open up the, you see here. Oh, I guess I need to go in here to environments. I just updated my Postman before the demo. Not always the best idea, but should work out. So I'll add the OAuth code here and go ahead and save it. Good, so now with OAuth code set, I should be able to exchange it. Let me go ahead and send this request. And it worked. So I got the access token, I got the scope, and I can also see the status is approved. Just if I might lose it, it might be good, I'll just store it here to our scratch pad. But now with this access token retrieved, I go back to the Ford simulator. I can try to send off a request to this simulator. So for instance, getting the vehicle status, which returns all different data for that vehicle. As soon as I do it, you can see it also shows up in the console that there was a pull request. I can expand and actually see also exactly what the data the vehicle was replying with, which helps in debug processes. If you have problems parsing the data, here in Postman, I can also see the JSON, all the different kind of dashboard warning lights. Let's go back down here. We got let's look for perhaps the odometer. Here we go. So we got odometer 2050 here as well. And of course, I can go in and change it, for instance, in the capabilities. Let's put diagnostics. And again, change this to something easy to remember, like 5,000. Let's send off that request again. And we go here, we got 5,000 kilometers. So using the REST API, pretty straightforward. And the workflow is pretty similar how it was before for the old simulator. It still works. It's a bit polished and a bit more refined. Of course, you can also use the REST API for the fleet class after you've done the fleet clearance. I just didn't go into that detail, but when you're working with our fleet API and you're not using MQTT, you can always create an access token using this endpoint, and then you get a similar OAuth code. I could actually also just quickly show it because we have still our valid simulator that we created before. So I could just put together the request here because we have basically access tokens. That's the endpoint, and then we just pass in the VIN. Oh, I think I changed the VIN, so let's go back and have a look what the VIN on my vehicle actually was. That was, here we go, just copy this one, just be safe. Here we go. So now I can create an access token for that vehicle. Oops, bin can't be blank. Oh, sorry, I had a bit of incorrect. So it's actually just the bin we need to provide here, not an array like that. Okay. Okay, so now you see when you create an access token for one of fleet vehicles, you get back exactly the same type of OAuth2 compatible access token. Looks exactly the same as when we created it for the kind of B2C use case. So in the end, what I want to show is that also when you work with the Sandbox environment, the ways to kind of activate vehicles, fleet clearance, individual driver application is the same. Or is different, I mean, not the same. But when you get the access token, that token is the same, and you can use it just the same way to retrieve data using any of our pull APIs or SDKs to get the data in the end. And just as a final part, we could have a look at if we actually got any data from our virtual VIN. It's awfully quiet here, so it doesn't seem like it for some reason. But in a live demo, some things always might go a bit wrong. But it should be up and running. I've been testing it before, so you can get some sample data here as well, and we will check in about this as well. Probably just a misconfiguration that I did somewhere. That's really the main things we wanted to cover today, because we have been looking at the fleet clearance, the new structure of the scenes, MQTT and OAuth2. I think that's already quite a lot of things to cover.